That's that. Let me introduce to you, most of you already know Desi Serna. Thank you, Desi. Desi and I met in Target. We met in Target. I wish I could say we met on stage at the Carnegie Hall, but we met at Target.
We were touring with Johnny Cash, I think.
Yeah, something. We could make a story up for you, but actually we just walked, we literally bumped into each other at Target.
Which aisle?
And we have become great friends. He's been on the show. We talked, about a year ago, we talked about all of the fretboard theory. We did a whole month on Desi and fretboard theory, and it was one of the most successful months we've ever had. So with live lessons and whatnot. So author of so many great books and resources. Would you welcome, please, Desi Serna.
Thank you, Steve. All right, so yeah, I'm Desi Serna, author of Fretboard Theory. I think a lot of you may have those books. That's a book that I originally self-published back in 2005, I think. And then I came out with the Fretboard Theory Volume 2, and it sold well on my website and on Amazon. And so it didn't take long until publishers started asking me to write for them. So I did a couple of books for Dummies publisher. Guitar Theory for Dummies, I know some of you had them because you brought them up here, I signed it for you. Which basically covers the same information that's in Fretboard Theory. It's just condensed a little bit in the for Dummies format. And then I also did a book called Guitar Rhythm and Technique for Dummies. And just yesterday, when Steve was sending me the information about coming here for this workshop, he said, "Oh, by the way, we'll have a merch table if you want to sell some product." Well, I wasn't thinking, and I didn't have any product on hand except for like a dozen guitar rhythm techniques for Dummies books. So they're back here on the table, but I don't even know if there's any left at this point. But and I was basically selling them very cheaply for $10. So you can check those out if there's any left. But of course, everything's available on my website and online. So anyway, so I teach on a variety of topics related to guitar theory, and specifically how guitar theory relates to popular music. So if you've read any of my books or watched any of my videos, you know that I always am talking about, this song by the Eagles or how Eric Clapton solos or that sort of thing, because I found that in my own experience and as a teacher that people want to learn about music, but they want to learn about music because they love this classic guitar music that, that's what has drawn them. So I created these methods that really focus specifically on the guitar and specifically on helping you understand songs that you're familiar with by artists that, you aspire to play like. So that's my thing, and I put it out, I think, just a week or so ago on the group that Steve created, that I was going to be here if you have any questions or anything you want to cover. So I think I had a handful of responses, and everybody asked about the pentatonic scale, and I actually received some more messages with some more questions about the pentatonic scale. So I thought, well, okay, that should probably be our topic. So that's what we're going to talk about today, the pentatonic scale. And what I'm going to do is just I'm going to give you an overview of, what is the scale, why do we learn it, what do you do with it, how can you get started if you're just in the early stages of getting started with scales, and what is that process like when you go from just learning a scale or its patterns to ultimately being able to improvise or compose with it, play licks and phrases, use it all around the fretboard to actually make some music. So we're going to talk about this. There may not be many opportunities for you to kind of play along here, and it's not going to be necessary that you necessarily memorize any particular step that I kind of demonstrate. What I hope that you can take away from this today is understanding how that whole process works, because, and then as you leave here today, you've got a better picture of how the process works, and you can work out those details that I mentioned at home, whether through one of my books or one of Steve's resources, or there's lots of great information all over the internet too, but it's just a little hard to know where do you start and what information are you looking for exactly. So let's get started. Let me pull up my notes here. and I'm going to start, with beginner stuff. So if you guys are already kind of past some of this beginner stuff, just be patient, and we'll get to something that's going to relate to your stage. So first of all, guitar players, play, scales, because that's what they use to play melodies and riffs and solos and bass lines and that sort of thing. So when you hear a part like that's a scale, right? Or you might play it together with some chords. So again, you play melodies, you play bass lines, you play riffs, you play guitar solos. With these scale patterns. So there are many different types of scales that you can learn in music and on guitar, but I would say that the two types of scale patterns that are used the most are definitely major scale patterns. That's kind of the most fundamental scale. And then pentatonic scale patterns. And I'll talk about the difference here in a minute. So if you listen to popular styles of music, so that would be styles of music that you typically hear on the radio, classic rock radio stations and that sort of thing. We're talking the Eagles or Eric Clapton or James Taylor, that sort of popular music. I'm not necessarily today's top 40, but that would be included too. I'm just looking around the room here, and I can't imagine many of you are listening to today's top 40. Any Taylor Swift fans in the house?
Hey, don't rub it in.
But if you were listening to that, well, they're using the same stuff too. But anyway, so popular music primarily uses major scale patterns or pentatonic scale patterns. And there's different ways that they can be applied, so you actually can get different types of sounds and scales out of the major and minor and that sort of thing. So the pentatonic is called pentatonic. Penta means five tones. And it's a simpler scale compared to most scales. Most scales have 7 tones. And the pentatonic only has 5. And you can play it in a minor version as well. Here's a full minor scale with 7 tones. And here's a pentatonic with just 5 tones. And in guitar, the pentatonic scale, because it has fewer notes, creates simpler patterns. And there's something about the sound. With the major scale, you have whole steps and half steps. And with the pentatonic scale, you either have a whole step intervals or you have a step and a half. And there's just something about that structure and that sound that works so well in pop music and in rock music. I played a little bit of My Girl as an example there. That's pentatonic. If you think about kind of rock and blues stuff. That's pentatonic. It's got those intervals. So it's not only, I think the scale has become so popular, the pentatonic, because its patterns are simpler. So a lot of guitar players prefer to play in pentatonic patterns over scales with more scale tones. But also because it has a cool sound. It has a cool sound, and many of the riffs and solos and even bass lines. Use these patterns. So, all right, so that's why we learn the pentatonic scale, because we want to be able to play some melodies and riffs and that sort of thing. So the process begins by learning how the notes are laid out on the fretboard and going through this. For some people, it's a tedious process of learning these patterns. I say for some people because you might be one of those people that enjoys it. I remember back when I was learning it, like I liked it. My hands just wanted to move across the fretboard, and I liked playing, I liked practicing scale patterns. So, but at any rate, some of you may not enjoy that initial step where you have to kind of map out the patterns and practice them because you're anxious to get to playing something not familiar. But the first thing you have to do is map out the notes. And you know, on the guitar, any set of notes that you play, even if it's just 5 notes, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. Let me back up a little bit. So you could start learning the pentatonic in any key. I typically will start in like E minor or G major, because that's a real popular guitar key, or A minor, C major, real popular guitar key. It doesn't really matter what key you learn them in. But you pick a key, and you start with its 5 notes. So I'm going to play, for example, these are notes related to E minor or G major, which are the same, relative major and minor. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So to keep this simple, I'll just call it E minor pentatonic. It's got 5 notes. And you don't have to learn this. You can go look up pentatonic patterns later when you're ready. Remember, you're learning this process. So there's only 5 notes there. And I played them. However, the notes can go up into the next register. So once you complete the scale, we go up into the next register, the next octave. And you could keep going, you know, higher, higher, and higher. And also, those notes are not just available in this position. You know, on the guitar that you can play the very same notes in different positions on different strings. So. So I'm playing the same notes in the same order. I was just playing them in different positions. And then when you get into, you know, going into the next register, long story short, the notes are all over the place. So they're scattered all over the fretboard. And if you have one of my books, the first thing I do is I show you a fretboard diagram. And here's all the notes of that particular pentatonic key all over the fretboard. It looks frightening. It looks like a daunting task to try to remember where all those little dots are on the neck. But what guitar players do is they just chop up the neck into sections, and you learn how to just play across that section. And you call it a pattern or a position, and you just memorize the look and the feel of that, and you just play up and down it. So for example, I'll stay here in this kind of open position. I'm playing in a key that utilizes some open strings. So here's E minor pentatonic notes, and I'm going to just keep playing until I run out of, I play all the possible notes I can in this particular position. All right, so that's as far as I can go unless I want to reach up to the next position, which I don't want to do. And that's considered a pattern. And so you play up and down it, you look at it on a neck diagram, you look at it on your fretboard, and you memorize it, you know, you play through it forward and backward. You work out some sort of fingering. Some teachers are really strict about fingering. I'm not, just because I am always changing my fingering depending on the situation, and there isn't always one particular fingering that works well in any given situation. So I usually tell people, find a fingering that works well for you and plan on changing it at some point, because something's going to come up where you're going to need to do it a little bit differently. And once you get a position down, then you would go to the next position. So I'm going to move up here to the next position. So now, if I'm staying in this position, how can I reach and play all of the notes related to this scale? This pattern looks like this. And then you just keep going. I mean, obviously you're going to need to spend some time on each position and each pattern. Give yourself some time to work out a fingering, to get the feel for it, to memorize it and play up and down. And you just keep going. Each position looks a little bit different, just the way the notes are located in positions that creates a unique pattern in each position. And they all have to be fingered a little bit differently. But they all have 2 notes per strings when you play the pentatonic scale. I played 5 different positions, 5 different patterns, and there are 5 patterns in the pentatonic scale, but you can see I've got more fretboard to cover here, so what happens is that the arrangement of notes in that first position end up just repeating here an octave higher. I end up getting the same type of pattern, which connects to the next one, and so on and so forth. And usually you learn these by numbers. Whatever you start with, you call that number 1 and number 2 and number 3. I do see teachers number them a little bit differently, depending on how you might have learned them or which pattern you learned first. Whatever pattern you end up learning first, whatever position you may be shown the scale in, you'll call that 1. So your 1 might be a little bit different than everybody else's 1. In my books, I numbered them the way that I most commonly see people refer to them, the way I most commonly see them taught, but those numbers don't really mean anything. They're just kind of there for your initial reference. Over time, you just think about the notes and the positions. You're not really thinking too much about it. All right, so anyway, so you're mapping things out. And like I said, this can be kind of tedious in this stage. So one of the things I recommend is for people to play over just generic accompanying place in E minor. There it is. We have someone manning the soundboard that could turn that up. So that, you know what that is? It's just some E minor. So as you play along with some chord accompaniment, you'll begin to hear the melodic potential of the scale, so it doesn't sound like it's so meaningless. Even with me just playing up and down patterns, it sounds a bit musical just because you're hearing the harmony of the scale. And as you get used to the patterns, you can kind of change directions and move around a little bit, attempting to try to make it sound a little bit more musical. We'll talk later in a little bit about how you can learn how to phrase and good licks and stuff to learn. So you can put out some accompaniment. And that makes a big difference. Usually right off the bat, a lot of students are like, you know, I like that better. I can sit and play like that for, 30 minutes. And you're learning the patterns, and you're developing some technique, and you're hearing, and you're getting closer to making music. Well, you are making music, It might just be in need of some more refining. All right, let's up here. And once you get one key down, then you can transpose. Transposing on the guitar is so simple. In the same way you can take a bar chord and just move it up a full step, you can take a scale pattern and move it up, or you can take a whole set of scale patterns and just move everything up one fret, and you'd be in a new key. So now I'm in a new key, F minor, or A flat major. So it's good to kind of play through the patterns in a handful of different keys. You don't always want to associate the scale patterns to one particular position, then you kind of get stuck in the rut. So you should be able to move those, just in the same way that you can freely move a bar chord around, and play major and minor chord shapes. You should be able to freely move scale patterns around and play scales with different keys without always thinking of it as relating to one specific fretboard position. So once you kind of get the patterns, under your belt a little bit, you're comfortable playing with them, you know how to transpose and move them around, then the next step becomes to actually put the patterns to use. And I recommend that you learn songs. And if you have any of my books or videos, you know that I list songs constantly throughout every chapter and every topic. I'll say, once you learn this chord shape, go learn these songs. Once you learn this scale, go learn these songs, because that's when that's when things are really going to click and connect. That's when you're going to understand things in context, you know. So, you know, this scale pattern doesn't really mean much, you know, like that. But same scale pattern. That's the same scale pattern. All of a sudden, now it sounds cool, right? So, or same scale pattern. So that's E minor, right? So as you start learning songs, you can see how it fits in the scale. And then that's when you start to learn how you can play licks and how you can play phrases. You see how other players move between the different pitches in the scale. You see how they incorporate articulations like hammer-ons or pull-offs or slides. And you can see what types of chords and chord changes they're playing that scale over. And so the pieces start to come together in your head. I explain to my students a lot that, you know, learning scales or anything in music, it's a lot like learning language. You know, when you learn the English language or any language, you have to learn the words and you learn about some of the grammar, but you learn phrases, right? You learn, hello, my name is, or which way to the restroom, that sort of thing. And so in music, you need to do the same thing as well. You know, you don't want to just say, oh, here's a, you know, there's a chord shape, or here's a, you know, a scale pattern. You want to know, how do I take that and how do I say something with it? And that's where songs come into play. Songs show you how others have said something with it and how you can say something. And you learn lots of songs and you learn those licks and phrases, and you see how other players use the scale. Right? So that was just the same scale, E minor pentatonic. If I'm playing up and down it like this, it doesn't sound so cool or exciting. But when you play Hey Joe by Jimi Hendrix, that's a little bit of Hey Joe there. The solo to Hey Joe. Then you see how you can really make some music. And then, you know, over time, you can look at these phrases and you can say, okay, well, I kind of get the idea. You can bend on this note. You know, you can pull off on this one and do other things. Slide into this one. So then you can kind of start taking those phrases and then just putting them in your own order and just making your own sort of statements with them without necessarily copying a specific solo. You know? That's how players improvise, because they've learned a bunch of solos. They know how to move through the scale. They know notes that they can bend, and then they can work on that process of improvising, which really means that they're just putting things that they know well and they've already played many times just in an impromptu order. But they're not improvising in the sense that they're doing something that they've never played or thought of before. You know, it's all just in the same way that when you're talking and putting together sentences, you're improvising. I'm improvising right now, but of course I'm using the language that where I've learned the words, I've learned the phrases, and I've learned the cliches and everything so that I can communicate. So that's the process that you want to follow when you are learning the pentatonic scale. Change the setting here. We're going to move on to a different topic on the scale here. But before I do, I want to mention that that process of initially learning the scale patterns and covering the whole fretboard is really one where you are exploring your options. And what I mean is it's not necessary for you to use every single pentatonic pattern or every portion of every pattern in every position. What you do is you map out all your options in the neck, you get used to these patterns, and you start learning songs, and then you will start playing to your strengths. It's okay to favor particular positions or patterns, particularly if you like the fingering or you like the reach or there's something about it that's easy for you. It's okay to favor those. In fact, you should. That's what most players do. So all of these famous players like Eric Clapton or Eric Johnson or Stevie Ray Vaughan or Joe Walsh or whoever, they all you usually don't see them cover all of the patterns. Eric Johnson, if you're familiar with him, comes to mind as someone who covers quite a bit of the fretboard. But many of the others will have just a couple patterns and pattern positions that they seem to favor, and they stick in those areas. A lot, you've probably heard of Beebe's box, It's just a particular pentatonic position that he just favored, and so he would stick in that quite often because he was comfortable in it, and he could really play to his strengths. So keep that in mind as you learn this scale or any other scale, or anything really, chords, that you're exploring your options, but then at some point you're going to say, okay, I know what my options are, but what works best for me, depending on how your hands work or what style of music you're playing, or whether you're primarily a rhythm guitar player or a lead guitar player. I've been talking a lot about riffs and solos here, but you can use the pentatonic, rhythm players use it too. Think about the opening to Pink Floyd's Wish You Were Here. That 12th string is playing some chords, and there's with some pentatonic scale. So that's pentatonic, right? So you don't necessarily need to be a lead guitar player to get use out of this scale. A lot of pentatonic parts are easy to play. My Girl was pretty simple as well. Out of tune here. So you guys have come from all over. How is this Nashville heat and humidity affecting your guitar intonation? Yeah, it's nuts. I figure this is like Music City. Couldn't they have picked, a different place where the humidity was a little, and the temperature was a little more under control?
Global warming.
Something. All right, so next we're going to move on. The next question was, how do you know what scale to use over a chord and progression? So I get this question a lot. People learn the patterns and learn some riffs and solos, and they're like, okay, but how do you, when you're faced with a piece of music that doesn't have a solo, and someone says, yeah, go ahead and jam on this song, how are you supposed to know what scale to use, right? So with the pentatonic, it's pretty simple. You can just you take your whatever the song you're playing over, and you find that primary chord. And if it's major, then you play its corresponding major pentatonic. If it's minor, you play the corresponding minor pentatonic. There is an exception to that rule, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But so let's just say, for example, you're playing something like Eric Clapton's "Wonderful Tonight." Let's see if I can get a loop going here. So this song has a handful of chords, G, D, and C, but everything kind of comes back and resolves on the G right there. Everything comes back and resolves on G, so that's kind of like the primary chord. That's a G major. So I can play G major pentatonic. Now I didn't get into details on how to identify the major and minor root in the pentatonic. I actually talked about that a little bit. But you just simply play G major pentatonic, which is what that lead line of that song is based on. It's got a little extra, something extra in it. And I can move to anywhere on the fretboard, but it's that simple. So let me give you another example. This one's going to be a little different. Let's see here. is based on the verses and some of the earlier solo sections to Sweet Child of Mine by Guns N' Roses. So this uses D, C at 9, a form of C, and a G. Same chords as Wonderful Tonight, really, but it's composed in a manner where G is not the primary chord. Everything kind of comes back and resolves to D major instead. So in this case, I play D major pentatonic over it. So. So that's what you do. You listen to a piece of music, try to find that primary chord, which chord is primary, and if it's a major chord, play the corresponding major pentatonic. And if it's a minor chord, then you can play the corresponding minor pentatonic over it. So here's a minor example about So in this case, I've got A minor, G, and F, but the A minor chord is kind of a home base. If I'm gonna resolve this, I'll probably resolve it on A minor, so I'll play A minor pentatonic over it. So on, and I could give you some different, different progressions here. It's really that simple. Just find the primary chord. It can be more complicated, but initially it's that simple. Find the primary chord and play the corresponding pentatonic. In that riff, that famous riff that we're all so familiar with, is just following the chords with playing up the C major pentatonic scale on the C chord, and then playing up the F major pentatonic on the F chord. Example of how you might actually change scales. You could do that. Generally speaking, the more complicated the chord changes are, or maybe even the quicker they change, guitar players are less likely to try to chase after them. And most of I would say it's more common for guitar players to just stick with one tonality and play with the progression. But you always have that option that you could actually follow the chord changes. Think about something like Little Wing by Hendrix. He's going through a series of chord changes there in the key of like G and E minor, and there's all these little licks and phrases, and he's just kind of like grabbing from each chord's related scale. He's on G, a little bit of the G major pentatonic, A minor, little the A minor pentatonic, if B minor, and you're kind of changing over each chord, which is a neat sound. It's a little more difficult to play. You got to think about what you're doing. You're constantly needing to reorient yourself in a new key, in a pattern, and follow the chord changes. That's not something that I would recommend you get into until after you feel comfortable sticking in one pentatonic key. So once you get used to playing in one major pentatonic key or one minor pentatonic key, you've kind of built up, an arsenal of some licks and phrases. Then you can start to slowly work toward trying to play over those songs where you might change. Just don't get ahead of yourself. But at least you know what the potential, what you can do with that there. All right, next question I received is how can you use the pentatonic scale along with major scales and modes? So we're gonna touch on modes here briefly. I'll try to keep this simple. The major scale has seven notes, and you can build a chord for each note in the scale. You can build your triads, your chords, so you can go through the whole scale and play chords. And then music can be composed by moving back, moving through any of those chords in any order that you want to put them together. And music can actually focus on any one of the scale degrees. You don't have to focus a song on the first scale degree. So I'm in the key of G here, for example. If I want to use its notes and chords to compose a piece of music, I don't have to start at G. I can start at any of them. So I might start on A minor. I'm still drawing the notes and chords from the G scale, but because I'm not actually starting on G, that's considered a mode. Technically, if you play on G, that's a mode as well. Every one of them is a mode. But typically, since music is played in either a playing major or a playing minor key, which are both modes, but because they're so common, they're not really considered modes. It's usually whenever a song is focusing on another scale degree that you wouldn't use as much that people would consider it to be modal. And in order to play and get a full modal sound, you would play the full major scale from which that chord progression is drawn. So for example, I was doing a little Santana there. So let's see. So this is notes and chords in the G major scale, but I'm focusing on the second degree, A minor. And I'll play notes of G over it, G major scale notes. Again, I'm focusing on the second scale degree. So that has a name, that's called Dorian mode, and it's kind of a unique, distinct sound. It doesn't sound like a major scale, it doesn't sound like a playing minor scale. But I could ignore that this song is in a mode, and I could treat it just like we treated our examples earlier. What's the primary chord in this progression? A minor. Just play A minor pentatonic over it. But the question is, well, how can you use both? How can you play pentatonic and modes? And all you have to do is just figure out the pentatonic scale that you would play over the progression. Figure out what the mode is. You know, what is the parent scale that the actual chord progression is drawn from? Figure out what those scale patterns are, and then just put them together. So in this case, G major scale patterns and A minor pentatonic patterns. And what most guitar players would do is they would figure out, of those two types of scale patterns, which ones do they prefer. Most guitar players prefer the pentatonic patterns. And then of the pentatonic patterns, this particular pentatonic pattern, which most guitar players know as pattern 1, is usually favored. So that's going to be kind of their go-to pattern. So if they were going to play the full modal scale over this progression, they would use a G major scale pattern that happens to fit right in the same position with their comfy, cozy pentatonic pattern. So if you know your major scale patterns, you know you have to map them out and learn just like pentatonic, a little bit more complicated, but there is a pattern that fits right over this position. So that's a G major scale pattern. So that one fits right over the pentatonic, and in fact, all of the notes in the pentatonic are in the major scale pattern. So you could think of it a couple different ways. You could think that you're combining both of those scale patterns, or some players, they see the pentatonic and they see that the major scale just adds a couple extra notes to it, and they just put it together and play in their pentatonic box, you know, with some added scale tones. What's nice is that you can use your familiar pentatonic licks that you pick up from your songs, you know. And then you can just get a little bit more variety and maybe add in a little bit more color or something to some of those major scale tones that aren't in the pentatonic. So. And then you can determine how often you want to hit on those major scale notes, how prominent you want them to be. You kind of, it's like cooking. You just flavor to taste. Do you want to just keep it strict pentatonic? Do you want to go full major scale and just start playing up and down major scale patterns, or somewhere in between? That's for you to decide. And certainly, as you learn songs that use pentatonic and major scale patterns, you'll see what other guitar players do, and you'll get ideas there on how to do that. They said, how can you use modes practically? The question was, they wanted to kind of know when to use modes. How do you know when it's the right time to use a mode? And the answer is when the song's in a mode. All right? If it's not in a mode, then you wouldn't use a mode. So for example, I'm playing a little bit of Oye Como Va here. So this song is in Dorian mode. That's how it's composed. It's got its notes and chords are drawn from the G major scale, focusing. So modes are, generally speaking, modes are not something you impose over a piece of music. Modes are what the music is based on, and you identify and say, oh, I see that. That's notes from the G scale, focusing on the 2nd degree, or that's notes from the C scale, focusing on the 6th degree, and you follow it. You follow it. So no matter, everything you play is going to be in a mode in one way or another. You just don't realize it. So by learning modes, you understand the construction, you understand how the music is composed, why those chords go together that way, why those notes fit, and you know what patterns you can instantly jump into so that you can add melody and stuff to them. So, all right, one final question we're going to cover here is, somebody asked, what about using the pentatonic along with cage system arpeggio patterns? So the cage system, the way that I teach it, is primarily a method for learning how major chord shapes are built on the fretboard. And if I remember when I first was introduced to the cage system, someone's like, yeah, cage, C, A, G, E, and D. Those are the 5 basic major chord forms. And I thought, well, I know that. All right, check that off the list. I know it. But then as I got into it more and I started to explore what happens when you move these shapes away from the open position, what happens when you think about other related chord tones that are in each position that are not part of the standard chord that you would play, playing up and down these notes as arpeggio pattern, breaking it up into fragmented chords. And if you guys have been through my cage instruction, you know that, like in my book Fretboard Theory, the cage chapter is the longest chapter. Like, you would never think that there was so much you could do with that system. And I focus primarily on its use in rhythm guitar parts, all the different types of chord inversions and chord voicings and fragments and stuff. You can play it all over the neck. But of course it has a use in lead guitar as well, because you can play chord tones like scale patterns. You can play through a chord's tones like you would a scale pattern to make an arpeggio pattern. Like, for example, right? So that was a D major there. You wouldn't play all of those notes together in a chord. You're not able to grab all those notes. You have to settle on some combination of them, right? That you can play simultaneously. But if you're going to play them one note at a time, then if you've got multiple notes on one string that are related to a chord, you can touch on them, right? And as you're playing in your familiar, comfy, cozy pentatonic patterns, let's go back to A minor pentatonic. So there's A minor pentatonic, and let's use this example, Oye Como Va by Santana. So the chord changes were A minor, or A minor 7, and D major, or like a D9 or something. I'll just use D major for now. So I could think about a D major arpeggio pattern in this position. It's an A form. And that fits right in the same position as my A minor pentatonic. So as I'm playing over those chord changes, when the chord change gets to D major, I can do a couple of things. If I can visualize that arpeggio pattern, I can see which notes in the scale are actually directly in the chord, and I can hit on those notes, because those are going to be strong notes, right? When you're on a D chord, if you hit on D notes, those are going to be strong notes. Or I can see what notes that are related to the D chord that are not in the minor pentatonic scale, but I could add to the scale, in this case. So there's the D. So here's A minor. Now I'm just playing up and down the patterns just to show you, but if I want to be a little bit more musical, I would just play A minor pentatonic, what's up? And when it gets to that D chord, I'm going to touch on some of those arpeggio notes from D. So something like. Could you tell how the playing there was more connected to the music? You could hear the chord changes in the lead line, and I was doing that because I was visualizing the scale pattern, and I was visualizing that arpeggio pattern, and then I was targeting those notes when that chord came up. So that's how you would use the cage system as a lead guitar player, and together with the pentatonic. And we are going to leave off with that because our time is up. Do we have time for a couple questions, or should we?
Yeah, one or two.
Yeah. Well, we'll maybe take a couple quick questions, but I'll mention that I don't have any of my guitar theory books here. I did have a couple of rhythm and guitar rhythm and technique for dummies, which gets into understanding rhythms and strum patterns and then techniques, hammer-ons, pull-offs, different sort of techniques. And we may still have some books back there on the table. All right, we have 7 left, and I'm selling for $10, which I think is about half of what they're selling for online. I'd be happy to sign them for you if you'd like. And many of you already have Fretboard Theory and Fretboard Theory Volume 2. I also have 33 hours of Fretboard Theory video instruction where I walk you through all the books and all the examples and just take you through it step by step in video format on my website. Just Google my name, Google Fretboard Theory, you'll find it, and it's a pretty extensive collection of video footage. You can either stream it online, you can download the files, and I do have DVDs available as well. So check that out if you would like to. If this sounds interesting to you and you want to go through that process, but you think you need some extra help and you want to be able to follow some videos step by step, that would be the way to do it. I think we got to wrap things up, unless we have a real critical question. Oh, I'm sorry. The exception. Good. Let's make this. I'll explain this real quick. We talked about playing major and minor pentatonic. Major over a major chord, minor over a minor chord. The exception is when you're playing blues and blues rock music will often play the minor over a major chord, okay? And I'll give you a quick example, and this is where we'll end. So here I'm playing a F sharp major chord, but I'll play the minor pentatonic over it. And I want you to notice that it sounds a little off. But if you phrase this right, it creates a blues sound that we all know and love. So, that's a little bit bit of Tracy Chapman's Give Me One Reason there. So blues players will sometimes play minor over major, and it creates a little dissonance. It's got an edgy sound to it, but that's kind of part of that blues flavor that we know and love. But just be careful, because some guitar players get started with scale patterns and they learn a blues song, and so they think, oh, I got it. This is how you apply the scale in all situations. No, that only works if the song has a blues flavor, and its melody and its other parts have got that sort of minor or major blues sound. If you try to play a blues over like Eric Clapton's Wonderful Tonight, try to play minor over that, it's not going to fit. So thanks, and I think that's where we're going to leave off.